Hi, I'm Bill Schmick. Welcome to 30 Minutes. Today, we're going to divide our show into two parts because of the subject matter. It's called The Incredible Shrinking Middle Class. Yep, that's you and I. And it's something that's been very topical in the news. It's so topical, in fact, that Janet Yellen, who is the chairwoman of the Federal Reserve Bank, just recently addressed the issue of income inequality. This is what she said. Income and wealth inequality are near their highest levels in the past 100 years, much higher than the average during that time span and probably higher than for much of American history before then. Okay, I think it is appropriate to ask whether this trend is comparable with the values rooted in our nation's history, among the high values Americans have traditionally placed on equality of opportunity. Is she right? Is it that serious? Well, I did a little research and I came up with some numbers, excuse the statistics, that I printed in one of my latest columns on income inequality. And this is what I found out. Last month, the Census Bureau found that the highest 20% of households earned 51.1% of all income last year. That's the biggest share on record since 1967. The share earned by middle-income households, you and I, fell to 14.3%. That was a record low. From 1979 to 2007, incomes of the richest 1% of Americans soared 275%. That same 1% earned 23.5% of all the income in the United States. That's the largest since 1928. At that rate, the rich are 288 times richer than you and me. Is it serious? Yeah, I think it's serious. We've experienced 30 years of rising income inequality in this country. Okay, as I said, 20% of households own 51% of all income. Now, at the same time, in the same 30 years, 15% of Americans now live below the poverty line. That's 46.2 million Americans have been left out of society. And since 2000, poverty among Americans has risen 46%. And if it wasn't for unemployment benefits and Social Security, many, many more would have fallen into poverty. How bad is it? You're not going to believe this, but the inequality gap today, okay, is larger than in 1774. That's right, 1774. I'll even go back. According to scholars, in ancient Rome, the top 1% controlled 16% of the empire's wealth. Today, in America, that same 1% controls 41% of all wealth. But you don't care. At least according to statistics, you don't care. Only 17% of voters thought that income inequality in the United States was important, even though it's growing faster and faster and faster. I guess most Americans are worried about what I call the Robin Hood effect. They're worried that with income inequality, if the government, for example, taxed the very wealthy, the top 5, 10, or 20%, and then distribute the money, that your kids, maybe not you, or maybe your grandkids, when they get to be as rich as Donald Trump, will have their money taken off them by the government. That's the Robin Hood effect. And we worry too, and we're told by the politicians, that without income inequality, capitalism just won't work. Therefore, it's un-American to even think that we should do something about income inequality. And besides, aren't the politicians always telling us that we're still the richest country in the entire world? So what are you complaining about? Well, let's go to this statistic about the richest country. I've heard that since I was a kid. What are they talking about? Well, they're talking about gross domestic product. What is gross domestic product? Excuse me for the lingo. What it is basically is all the wealth, all the income, everything that is produced in this country each year, and that's called the gross domestic product. I don't know why they use these big terms for this, but so that means that you bought a McDonald's hamburger, you went to a sewing class, you paid Netflix, whatever, all of that is added up by the statisticians once a year, and that comes to gross domestic product, okay? And you may have heard this other phrase, per capita GDP. Don't get me started about this lingo. Per capita, per person. Why don't they call it what it is? Per person. It means that if you take the entire GDP of the United States and you divide it by the amount of people, you come up with a certain per capita GDP. The amount of wealth per person, the amount of income per person. So why don't we just do that, okay? So let's look. What is GDP? GDP last year was $16.7 trillion. And the population in the United States, give or take a million or so, was say 315 million. So what do? Well, we take that 16.7 trillion and we divide it by 315 million, and we get $51,450.74. Okay? Now, I want everybody in the audience to raise their hand if they're making $51,000 a year. Not you and your wife or your husband, just you. I don't see too many hands raised, and you're right. You know why? Because of that money, less than, 26% of all Americans earn $51,000 or more a year. So the next time you hear a politician or economist telling you about per capita GDP, throw it at them, because it's not true. What point is it to have $51,000 per capita GDP when the majority of us are making under that? What are we talking about? I'll tell you. Over 51% of Americans are making under $30,000 a year. Okay? So what does it matter that we're the richest nation on earth per capita GDP? Now, interestingly enough, there's a bunch of social scientists and economists that for some time now has come up with an index that actually compares how well off we are here in the United States versus other people. For example, in income inequality, look, if you're living in some neighborhood and the neighbor next door is making about what you are, why are you worrying about income inequality? Okay, sure, you're hearing the stories about the baseball player that's making $2 million a year, or the football player, or whomever, or the inventor of whatever is making trillions of dollars, but that's really not that important to you. It's what your neighbor is making. Well, these economists and sociologists came up with an index, okay? It's called the Gini index, G-I-N-I, okay? And what it does, it measures how society's wealth is distributed, okay? How equitable is a nation in the distribution of its wealth? And what they did is they created a scale, 0 to 1, okay? 0, if you get a 0 as a nation, that means that all the money in your nation, all that GDP, is distributed equally among everyone. And 1 would mean that all of that wealth in whatever country you're talking about is given to just one person. So 0 to 1, right? So obviously, the higher the score towards 1, the less income equality there is in your country. Now, let's take the developed nations, okay? The developed nations are nations in Germany and Spain and Australia and places in Asia like Japan, so forth and so on, okay? If you added up the score of all those developed nations, it would come to around 0.32. Remember, 0 to 1, 0.32, okay? Where is the United States? You're not going to believe this. The United States ranks 38.38. That's worse than any developed nation on earth. Okay. Now, it gets worse. Okay. If you add in our taxes and distribution of different government funds and so forth, the actual number goes higher to over 40. So what that's saying is that the governmental taxation and transfer agency, Social Security, Medicare, and all of that has been shaped over the years to actually increase the income inequality in the world, okay, in the United States. Now, if you look at us, that is the United States, we're probably sandwiched somewhere between Cote d'Ivoire and Uruguay. There are some emerging market countries, such as Chile and Mexico, that actually have better income distribution than we do. That is, that their income is more equal than the United States. And places like Turkey, which beat us, they're emerging markets. So if we're looking at that, that's a shock. But when we go down to some of the states in the United States, because you can use this Gini index to compare individual states to other countries, we become even more of a shock. So let's take some places close to home. How about us in Vermont? Vermont at 0.44 is about equivalent to the Congo, yes, the Central African Republic. And if you look at places like New Hampshire at 0.425, that's about equal to Cambodia. And Massachusetts at what, 0.475, Cameroon. And Connecticut is about equal to Venezuela, okay? Now, what Janet Yellen, the Fed chairman, and a number of other economists are worrying about, that income inequality undermines democracy. Okay, now, what do they mean by that? When we have GDP growing, as we do now, okay, without income equality, okay, the majority is no better off. And in fact, they start to leave the system. It's one of the problems with the unemployment rate now, is that a number of people have just given up looking for work. As our well-being as a nation begins to decline, and as we begin to compare ourselves, not with our neighbor, but with other countries, okay, it starts to affect up here and in here. You see, wealth only matters when it increases the well-being of individuals. And in this country, that's not happening. So what happens to individuals who earn less and less and less and less? They start giving up their stake in society, the incredibly shrinking middle class. In other words, the middle class had been the great bulwark of this country for years and years and decades. Okay, that is starting to crumble. We're less committed to the political system. You hear all the time that the politicians cry that the voter registration is down, that less and less people are voting, that our young are no longer voting, or voting in less and less numbers. That's also part of income inequality. And then, if this continues, there's an increasing disregard for law and order. Okay, now we haven't seen that in this country. We're fairly law-abiding. However, as time goes by, a lot of sociologists and economists do worry about that as well. And we've seen it before. We've seen it in many other countries where this is concerned. Now, just today at breakfast, someone said, but isn't America still the land of opportunity? And you wonder, is it, given this growing income inequality? Well, the last poll by the pollsters basically found out that 29% of voters said it was extremely important for government to increase the equality of opportunity. 41% polled said that there's not much opportunity in America. 41%, still not that bad, but that's up from 17% when it was last polled in 1998. The middle class is not only at a standstill, it's shrinking. So, without the dream, how does one survive in America? We don't know that answer yet. I mean, the scientists and so forth have come up with dozens and dozens of views as to why this is happening in the United States, and actually it's happening all over the world. There was a statistic recently, about 6 months ago, that said, it was I don't remember the number, 50 or 60 people had as much wealth as 1/3 of the entire population now, the population in poverty in the world. In other words, a busload of people had more money than the lowest 1/3 of people in the entire world. Billions, okay? So it's not just in the United States this is happening. However, it is accelerating in this country. Now, why do we think that this has occurred? Well, we'll have to go back a couple of years, 30 years actually, when it started. And a lot of people tend to want to blame President Reagan and Reaganomics and so forth. But I believe that this whole issue really just coincided with that period of time. What happened was the rise of the emerging markets. China, for example, or Vietnam, or India, Brazil, these areas of the world started to move from being very, very poor to actually getting jobs, okay? Now, why? Because largely the developed world, the United States and Europe, started to export the production of certain goods and services to those countries where the labor cost was much, much lower. Okay, so this was a great deal for us. We could all go to Walmart and watch prices of things go down and down and down over the this past 30 years, and we were happy about it. But what it did is put a lot of pressure on wages, okay, especially unskilled wages, not only here, but all over the world. In other words, if a country was like China could produce T-shirts for $1 a piece because the labor market was getting 30 cents an hour,